Hey everyone, thanks for joining us today. We hope that you enjoy today's sermon by our pastoral staff at Christpoint Church. We also want you to know that if you have any questions, prayer requests, or need information on any of our ministry opportunities, you can email us at info@christpoint.church. We love you and we are praying that this will be the best year yet. Welcome home.
Now, we agree it's everything God says. We agree we have to eat grapes like grapefruits. We agree it's everything that I have ever imagined. But 10 out of those 12 said, but there's just giants in the land. Y'all, we can't do this. 10 guys turned the opinion of a whole nation. Now, 600,000 men, more than likely 2.5 million people. And they turned the entire nation from faith to fear. So God punished them. Now, God's not punishing us today because Jesus has already paid. He already took our punishment. But God punished them, this entire generation, not because they were afraid. Now, let's get this straight. The Lord didn't punish them because they were afraid. It's okay to be afraid. You know, I'm sure when David first encountered his first lion, I'm pretty sure he was afraid. It's okay. I'm pretty sure that when David saw the first bear and the second and the third, he was fairly afraid. There's an element of fear there. I'm sure when David walked up on the scene with Goliath and nobody would step into that valley and fight the giant that was 10 feet tall, I'm sure that David, can you imagine this guy probably weighs 800 pounds. Almost 4 times what David weighs. Or a little over probably. And I'm sure David had an element of fear. But see, it's okay to be afraid. It's okay to be afraid. God didn't punish them because they were afraid. He punished them because they had a lack of faith. He punished them because of their lack of faith. It's okay to be afraid just as long as we don't let fear have power over faith. That's where we break down. When we let fear have power over faith. When we look at it and we say we can't do it, instead of saying, in other words, when we build our world with us in the center, we're always going to look at things in fear. But when God builds our world with Him in the center, we're going to look at it differently. So, this is what happened. Into the desert they went. Into the desert they went for 40 years. 1 day, 1 year punishment for every 1 day they were in the land. So in other words, God says, I'm sending you out there so your entire generation can just pretty much die off and I'll take a brand new generation into the promise. Into the desert, 40 years wandering, 40 years walking, 40 years setting up tents, 40 years taking down tents, 40 years eating manna every morning before it disappeared, and 40 years of complaining. 40 years. Do you think, this is where I want to kind of key in on, do you think maybe some of those people were caught up in a storm they didn't ask for? Do you think maybe Moses was caught up in a storm he didn't ask for? Do you think maybe his sister Miriam was caught up in a storm? His brother Aaron was caught up in a storm they didn't ask for? You think Joshua, Caleb was caught up in a storm they didn't ask for? Sometimes maybe we're caught up in a storm that we didn't ask to be caught up into. I didn't ask for you. So why should I suffer when I didn't ask for this to start with? So maybe they said things like, why should we suffer over the decisions that 10 cowards made? Why do we have to suffer the same consequences as the cowards had to serve? So maybe they said things like, why do we get punished when we didn't make the decisions to get us here to start with? Maybe I would have made the decision to go on in. I can guarantee you Caleb and Joshua sat here and said, no, God's given it to us. They're just in the way. Let's go take it. But no, they suffered the same consequences. They both got the same whipping. They both got their airports thrown away. So maybe some of them said, I feel disrespected. I feel cheated. I feel like my voice doesn't matter. Because when you're sitting there, 2 out of the 12, and you're 2 against 10, and you're saying, no, let's do what God says do, you feel like your voice doesn't matter when 10 flip the entire nation's opinion. That entire generation died out in the desert, by the way. So during that 40 years, I'm sure they said things like, will our breakthrough ever come? I'm sure that when they're setting up tents, taking down tents, walking, and just wondering, you know what? This is not my idea of the promise. You know, I thought the promise was going to look a little more promising than this. I'm sweating, y'all. I'm sweating. You know, do you realize I smell? I mean, this I'm telling them. Do you realize I smell bad, but the guy next to me smells worse than I do? We're out in this desert, and we got these big cloths on, and we're burning up, and I can't stand myself right now. The promise is not looking very promising. When's our breakthrough ever going to come? Maybe they said, we will never, or will we ever get to the promise? Will we ever see the promise? See, here's the rebuttal. Here's the rebuttal from the fearful factor, from the ones who are afraid. This is what will always be said. Oh, you don't want to go in there. You don't want to go in there. My uncle went in there. There's giants that live in there. Trust me, settle for the desert. You don't want to go in there. Trust me, the desert is safer. You don't want to go in there. Trust me, you lose nothing in the desert. You will lose everything if you go in there because they will beat you down in there. They are giants. You will lose nothing in the desert, but here's the thing, you gain nothing in the desert. So you'll lose everything if you go in there, but you'll lose nothing. So in other words, if I don't gain anything and I don't lose anything, I don't want to go through life and shoot a par. You know what I'm saying? I want to have some advancement. So you stand to lose everything in there. And just like that, minds were changed. Just like that. Well, you're right. Yeah, you're right. So I'm going to show you something as we flip to the end here just a second. So now we've set up how just normal thinking can start doubting God. Now this is how it started. Right out of the gate, they watched the Lord bring plagues and destruction upon Egypt, part the sea, water from a rock, and all this stuff. They watched over, many, many more things than that, and then they still yet can't have any faith in the Lord. So we're going to circle back to that at the end. Let's jump forward to actual Babylon. Let's jump forward. King Nebuchadnezzar is the king of Babylon, and he goes into Judah, and he carries off the people in Jerusalem. He carries them away to Babylon. Some say 500 miles as a crow flies, 700, 800, maybe 1,000 miles of trekking, up and down and twisting and turning. So let's just say 700, 800 miles into Babylon. So I'm sure during this Babylonian exile, I'm sure some said things like, why do we have to suffer when we didn't do anything wrong? I'm sure some said, why should we lose everything along with everybody else? We pray. We read the Word. We pay our tithe. We give to charity. We're good people. We serve the Lord. So you kind of see the very same things probably being said in the desert with Moses' crew as we're finding with the nation of Israel a few generations later being exiled into Babylon. So I'm going to show you why all this happened and why all of them had to leave. So first of all, 2 Kings chapter 17, verses 7 and 8. So I'm going to you can kind of read that. I'm going to kind of break I'm going to give you the cliff notes. They sinned against God. This is one reason why God says, you know what? I got to get your attention. In other words, if you keep going like you're going, you're just getting worse. Number one is they sinned against God. Number two, they worshiped other gods. Number two, they followed the practices of the other nations' gods who they had driven out. In other words, here's what I'm going to challenge you. You cannot allow God to drive sin out of your life and then go right back to serving the sin. Maybe it's in a different package. Maybe it just, you know what? I need this man out of my life. I need this man out of my life. And God, I need you to get him out of my life. And God gets him out of your life. And you go over here and you find his evil twin. And he's the greatest thing that ever lived. He treats me like duty, so to speak. So in other words, you've just traded one sin for the very same carbon copy of sin. So this is what they did. They literally, God drove out those gods and they invited them back in to worship them. So we've got sin that's rampant. We've got worshiping other idols that's normal. It's normal. So let me just show you why is it we all have to suffer? Let me show you what it looks like. 100 years ago, if you showed one thing that we see on television today, which there was no television 100 years ago, but if you showed one thing, you probably were blacklisted. Because there was more of a holiness. There was more of a holiness and a sanctification type walk with the Lord. Now, as we go and we get watered down and we become accustomed and we get used to hearing the words, we get used to seeing, we get used to the lies, we get used to telling them. After a while, we don't look the same as we were supposed to look. So we've just allowed the same gods back in, and we've worshiped the same gods. So how did we get in Babylon right along with everybody else? So let me just show you. Why do we all have to suffer the same consequences? Leviticus chapter 25. Verses 2, 3, and 4. This is God speaking to Moses. And this is what God says. Now, you're not in the land yet. Your people's not in the land yet. It's going to be quite a while before you get there. But this is what he says. When you speak to the people of Israel and say to them, when you come into the land that I give you. Why would God say this if it wasn't important? This is what God says. The land shall keep a Sabbath. In other words, you can't wear yourself out and everything else out, because you have got to have a Sabbath. So the land shall keep a Sabbath to the Lord. Verse 3, for 6 years you can sow your fields. In other words, you can plant. For 6 years you can prune, you can cultivate. For 6 years you can gather, you can harvest. So for 6 years you can go through the routine. You can plant, you can cultivate, and you can harvest. You can do all of these things for 6 years. But, verse 4, but in the 7th year there shall be a Sabbath of solemn rest for the Lord the entire year. And rest for the land, a Sabbath to the Lord. You shall not sow your field or prune your vineyards. In other words, this is what this is saying. And this is where I think it comes home to us. If the land doesn't rest, it becomes barren. If the land doesn't rest, it's going to become barren. And here's the key. Here's where I think the key is in this. To give 1 year to the Lord out of every 7. Now, you got to realize, God says, you're not planting on that 1 year. Now, that's asking a lot. In other words, you're not clocking in that whole year. You're not cultivating. That means you're not showing up for work. Now, I'm not saying don't show up for work. And you're not harvesting. That means you're not getting paid. Out of every 7 years, you can work and have a big time. You can have all that you want. But you know what? If I can't give you what you need in 6 years and you take a 7th and give the land a rest, then you and I don't even need to be walking together. If you can't trust me in that I will give you an abundance in 6 years that you couldn't do in 7 years. So here's why I think the key is it requires faith that God will provide when nothing is coming in. Because I'm going to tell you what, it's good to have faith. And it's easy to have faith that God's going to provide for us when we have a job. Well, God's going to provide for me. Well, it's easy to say that. But when we have to walk an entire year out of every 7 and say, you know what? God's taught me to rely on Him. God's taught me that He gave me more than enough in those 6 years that I have to let everything rest for 1 year so I can continue to have more than enough in the other 6 years, and it continues to cycle. So how did they react to the Sabbath of faith? How did they react? Leviticus, the next chapter over, verse 26, verses 33, 4, and 5. Verse 33, and I will scatter you among the nations. In other words, if you don't do this, then this is what's going to happen. I will scatter you among the nations, and I will unsheath the sword after you, and your land shall be a desolation, and your cities shall be a waste. In verse 34, then the Lord shall enjoy, then the land shall enjoy its Sabbaths, multiple, as long as it lies desolate. Nothing going on. As long as it lies desolate, while you, get this, while you are in your enemy's land. While you are in your enemy's land. In other words, God is telling them straight up, you're going to be disobedient. I know you. I know everything that's going to happen. I know every thought that's ever going to be thought. I know every secondary thought and every possibility. And you're not going to do this. And this is what's going to happen. And I'm telling you what's going to happen. I'm going to have to step in, or you're going to have nothing. You're going to have a dead land, and it's not even going to be worth anything. So I'm going to take you out and put you in your enemy's land. In other words, I'm going to be put in Babylon. I didn't ask to get there. So I'm going to put you in Babylon because you know what? It's going to be easy to fall into this little setup as time goes on. You know what? The things that we wouldn't say 100 years ago are not, they don't even bother us today. The things that we would think 100 years ago, it's a normal thought. So, this is, continue in verse 34. Then the land shall have rest and enjoy its Sabbath, verse 35. As long as it lies desolate, as long as the land is desolate, and there's no activity on it, it shall have its rest, the rest that it didn't have on your Sabbaths when you were in the dwelling, where you were dwelling. In other words, this is what I'm doing what you should have been doing, and you won't do it. So Judah didn't rest the land for 490 years. 490 years they didn't rest the land. Now out of 800, they began to start just gravitating to, you know what? I just think that we just keep on harvesting. What's it matter if we harvest? We'll do it next time, all right? And then the next time, we'll do it next time. And after a while, 490 years have passed. And then God says, you know what? This time's up. You owe the land and you owe me a number of Sabbaths that add up to 70 years. That's where we get that. That's where that 70 years comes from. What doesn't get devoted to the Lord becomes barren. So let me tell you this real fast. This is our lesson today from the Old Testament. What doesn't get devoted to the Lord is going to become barren. It's going to lack productivity. It will not reproduce. So what doesn't get devoted to the Lord is going to slowly die. It's going to slowly lose life. So, in other words, if I spend more of my efforts and more of my resources on me, if I place me at the center and not Jesus, then things that are important to me are slowly going to lose life. They're slowly going to become barren. They're slowly going to become non-productive. What doesn't get devoted to the Lord slowly loses life. So Jeremiah 25:11. This is what Jeremiah says. The whole land shall become a ruin and a waste, and these nations shall serve the king of Babylon 70 years. Boom. So all of a sudden, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. What has happened is, in order for this land to rest, everybody has to go into the same Babylon. Because if not, you know what's going to happen? I'm going to take the 10 out, and the others that are left are just going to keep doing what they've been doing. So Judah was exiled to Babylon for 70 years because they chose to cultivate fear instead of trusting God. I was afraid that I wouldn't have enough. I was afraid. You know, I'm going to go back to that chapter in the book that I wrote when God said, give me 5 days. Then I want you to go lay hands on a man. Didn't say healing, just said go lay hands on a man. Now at that time, I thought the man was going, with cancer dying in a few days, was going to get up and walk outside and we're going to drink iced tea. But give me 5 days. He said, give me 5 days. And I became, in those 5 days, a better business owner, a better father, a better taker care of my yard than I was devoted to the Lord. I could worship the Lord, But I found out real fast that I needed to consume myself for 5 straight days in order to do the task that God called me to do. And I saw real fast how difficult that was for me to do. I was young. I was dumb. I chose to cultivate customers rather than cultivate trusting God. Rather than doing that. So, how did we get here? How did we get here? We put, in this country, and we got good at it, we put personal gain over godly devotion. We got good at it. We placed personal gain over godly devotion, and we slowly heated up the furnace. But something happened in the 40 years in the wilderness journey that also happened in the exile to Babylon. And that's what I wanted to circle back around to. This is what I want to remind you of. You say, I feel like I'm in Babylon in this world today. I mean, I turn the TV on and Israel's under attack. You know, I turn the TV on and all I hear is negative. All I hear is how bad everything is getting. I feel like I'm living in Babylon. Well, let me just reassure you that, yeah, we're in Babylon. But I just want to reassure you something. I want to go back to that desert wandering. I want to go back to the Babylonian days. God never ceased to be their God. We're going to look at some of this next week. God never ceased to be their God. Number 2, they never ceased to be His children. You know, I've gotten mad at my children before. Doesn't mean that they ceased to be my children. I just got mad at them. They got mad at me. They never ceased to be God's children. They were never not cared for by God. He fed them when they were hungry. He clothed them when they needed covering. He housed them. Their clothes didn't wear out. Not once it says it in the Word, but twice. Their clothes didn't wear out, neither did their shoes. And the promise that they didn't get to encounter, the promise never ceased to be the promise. It never moved, it never relocated, and it never changed. And here's the thing, God never gave their promise to someone else. God never. So, yeah, we may be spending some time in Babylon, but God's still our God. We're still His children. The promise is still there. We just may have to wait a little longer than what we thought. It hasn't moved. It hasn't changed. It hasn't been relocated. And God's not given our promise to somebody else. The people in the wilderness, they eventually came out of the wilderness after 40 years and possessed the land. The people in exile in Babylon, they eventually went home in waves. They went back home. They rebuilt the temple. They rebuilt the altar. They rebuilt the walls. They rebuilt their city. They eventually went back home. But let me show you something in Jeremiah 25:12. Then after 70 years are completed, I will punish the king of Babylon. And that nation, the land of the Chaldeans, for their iniquity, declares the Lord, making the land an everlasting waste. Maybe you feel like an exile. Maybe you feel like an exile in a system you weren't built for, you didn't ask for, and you weren't designed for, and you didn't want to be placed there. See, Babylon didn't escape the judgment of God either. You know, I've asked this question this week. Why do the wicked seem to always prevail? Why does the evil always seem to get their way? Why can't the righteous stand up against the evil? Why can't we do that? Babylon didn't escape their judgment. It just didn't happen in the people's time. Have you ever heard this? I saw it on a sign yesterday. Bloom where you're planted. Have you ever heard this? If you can't dance with the one you want, then dance with the one you're with. You may not be where you want, but be productive where God has you. Be productive where you is. So I may not be where I want to be, but I'm going to dadgum sure be productive where God has planted me. If your life, where you are right now, if if it's not what you imagined it to be, I want to invite you to make that better. How's your relationship? Is your life where you imagined it to be? How's your relationships? If the land doesn't rest, it'll die. What doesn't get devoted to the Lord becomes barren. If you're too busy, this is probably everything in this sermon summed up into one last sentence. If you're too busy to serve the Lord, then things around you will become barren, and they will lose productivity, and they will die. Just simple. I can't put it any simpler than that. If you're too busy to serve the Lord, then we can watch the things around us die. So, I want to tell you a quick story and finish this up. A friend sent me an email. Said, how do you catch wild hogs? Said, well, you put out some corn. And then when the hogs get used to it, they become accustomed to it, and it becomes normal for them. You put up one fence. And then they're a little freaked out, but then they go right back. They go right back to what they're used to. And then you put up a second fence, and they kind of get freaked out, and they go right back. A third fence, they get freaked out. Then you start building the fourth one in with a gate. And then one day when they're all in there, you slam the gate. He says, then they all go freaking out wild, and then after a few minutes, they settle down, they go right back to eating. He said, that's how you catch wild hogs. We start moving away from what we were slowly until we get boxed in. And you know what? Maybe we're just not even serving the Lord like God intended us to. Maybe we built Him on the outside and we're on the inside. So, please stand with me. Please bow your heads and close your eyes. I want to ask you to pray a sinner's prayer. And I want to ask you this question one more time. Again, this last question. Where's your devotion? If you have more devotion to something else, if you're too busy to serve the Lord, then things around you are going to start dying. Let me tell you something. Your relationships will not be healthy if this relationship is unhealthy. That's just all there is to it. And sometimes I need to let some of these things go. These are the things that are the little foxes. And I need to make sure that this relationship tells me what's most important in my life. Hello again, and thank you for tuning in. I pray that today's sermon has spoken to your heart and has ministered to you well. We just want you to know that we have two locations, one at our Sparta campus, our main campus at Sparta on the square in Sparta, and our second campus is at Smithfield behind Ace Hardware. And we would love for you to call Christpoint Church your church home. And if you're viewing this and you can't get in to church and you feel like you want to be a part of the church, then you can always be a part of the church. Just drop us a note and let us know that you enjoy being on board with us. And if you'd like to give and be a part of the ministry, then you can do that by just sending a check to one of the locations at 614 Murphy Street, Smithfield, 13 Liberty Square in Sparta, and we'll get you on the road. We just love you so much, and you can download the Christpoint Church of Tennessee app, and you can give online. So we are real people. We're living real lives, and we're serving a real God. And we just want to tell everyone, welcome home. We're so glad that you tuned in with us. Welcome home.